Welcome to the Underhood Service podcast. This episode is presented by Mala, manufacturers of engine components, filters, and peripherals. Visit mala-aftermarket.com to learn more. And now, here's your host, Andrew Markell.
Welcome to the fourth installment of the Underhood Service podcast. Today we're talking about air filters and cabin air filters. With me today is Tom Walsh from Mala. He's the product coordinator for filtration and thermal management. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to discussing air and cabin filters with you.
So I know it's a big hassle when you start inspecting the air filter on a lot of vehicles because the housing, there's usually multiple things. It's not just one or two clips. It's usually 6 or 7 nuts or screws to take off. Once they get it open, what should they be looking at the filter and also the filter housing?
So in the filter itself, again, it's just the type and size of particles, kind of the obvious stuff. You got seeds or whatever from a tree or cotton from a cottonwood. That's kind of normal stuff. Now, if you're seeing stuff just fall out of the filter, or if you're seeing the filter almost like it's sucked in, you know, that's kind of another issue, a failure of the media itself. Another big thing to look at is oil, because oil is going to be a sign of another issue. If you got oil, it could be a clogged PCV valve. If your PCV valve is clogged, you got a couple different options. Is it clogged because it's a faulty valve? Or is it something like worn rings where oil's getting by now and then that's eventually clogging the PCV valve? So that's just a good telltale sign of something to look at. And it doesn't necessarily have to be saturated with oil, but even a drop or two of oil is going to leave a mark on an oil filter. And it should be fairly easy to tell on, a lot of the yellow media, white media, sometimes light blue filter media. Oil's going to hit it and expand, and it's going to make a mark, and you should be able to tell. And that at least will provide you something to look at for further inspection and generally towards the PCV valve. And is that valve failed because the valve failed, or is the valve failed because another reason?
You mentioned before about a filter being sucked in due to the pressure differential. Is that a sign that the filter's overly restrictive?
That definitely could be a sign the filter is overly restrictive. That could be a sign that the oil filter housing is cracked and maybe it's getting in more air than it should. And
then also, let's say it's a recently installed filter, not your brand, and it's been sucked in. Is that a sign that the filter manufacturer didn't do their homework and they didn't install a filter that's rigid enough? Or
yeah, for sure. So that would probably be a failure of the media and just not the OE specification media. We like to say meter exceed OE specifications. So much goes into each OE part, so much engineering, so much time. There's those standards there for a reason. As techs, we always see where the OE, there's part failures, and that's where you want an OE, something that exceeds OE quality, right? But for the most part, OE specifications and qualifications are to a very high standard. So we want to at least meter exceed those.
So what determines when that air filter needs to be replaced? Is it mileage? Is it just an inspection standard? Can a flashlight go through it?
For me, it's a mix of guidelines and driving conditions. How do you drive? Are you towing? Are you in the desert every day? What's affecting your filter? If you're just an average commuter in Metro Detroit, for example, I'd say go by your OE mileage guideline. And then if you're going by that guideline, at least ask your tech, or if you're changing it yourself, what's it look like? Do I need to change the intervals of this? And then, of course, another thing besides just like a sandy environment or something like that is a maybe LA, if there's a smog warning, that's going to be really hard on your air filter too. So if you're driving even just a normal commute in a city like that, I'd change your air filter more often.
Back to the housing itself. A lot of these vehicles we see on the roads nowadays, the average age is 12 years old. So that means it's probably been through at least 4 or 5 different filters, and that filter housing may be cracked. What is the criteria to really look at to see if the box is leaking?
If it has a crack anywhere on the housing, for best filter performance, we're going to recommend replacement. That's not always realistic if you have a customer under a budget, for example, and they have to wait till next month. So I think one thing to look at is upstream. Is it affecting, is there a downstream mass airflow sensor? Is that crack going to allow too much air and it affect that sensor? Throw a check engine light. That's something that would need to be repaired. Now, if you're below kind of where the air is coming in before the filter, then make your best judgment and repair it. And there's definitely ways, smoke tests, you can put smoke in. If smoke's pouring out of there, that needs to be fixed. you can use your smoke machine, put some smoke in there, and it's maybe not really coming out, then that little crack's not going to cause a huge issue. And of course, you're not going to find it in all data, your OE guidelines, but duct tape's a wonderful thing. So.
So let's kind of get into the cabin air filter.
Okay.
You know, a lot of these cabin air filters are really tough to access. There's quite a bit of disassembly depending on the vehicle. Is it better to go by mileage or inspection on some of these vehicles?
Again, this is where mileage and OE guidelines, yes, but then environment, of course. And some things I look for with environment is not just necessarily where you're driving, but where is your car parked? Because sometimes, a lot of times on the cowl is where that air is going in. And now you're getting leaves in the fall and everything that maybe your car's been parked, but now you have all these leaves coming down every time you start your car, all that dust and pollen and everything's getting sucked in. So just be aware of what kind of conditions you drive it in, what kind of conditions you park your car in, what kind of air you think is just coming into your car, to your HVAC system.
What if a cabin air filter was installed backwards?
If a cabin air filter was installed backwards, it would clog sooner. That's because there's different sides to a cabin air filter. A cabin air filter, it needs to filter the bigger particles first, and then it filters the big ones, then smaller. So you don't want it to flip it around and you're filtering the small particles first. So you want it to be the correct way in the vehicle. Otherwise, it's just going to fail sooner, and you're going to get more pollen in your car. And if you have allergies, that's a big issue. So just make sure you install it with the airflow arrows facing the correct way.
Hey, thank you, Tom, for that great information on air filters and cabin air filters. They're often neglected, and they're in some cases difficult to inspect. Are there any tips for cabin air filter replacement for technicians should know?
Just follow the guidelines for cabin air filters. I don't think they're again a pretty cut and dry part. Clean out the housing. That can be a big issue if you have some bigger stuff getting in there, or clean out where the air comes in can solve some issues too. Where that pollen, that whatever's coming in, or the HVAC system's bringing in the fresh air, clean that off, and you'll have a longer life filter.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to Mala for sponsoring this podcast, and thank you to our readers for downloading this podcast and taking a listen.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Underhood Service podcast for more episodes. And visit us online at underhoodservice.com.